Sometimes the loudest alarms don't sound like sirens. They echo in silence, in shadows, in headlines, and in fear. We live in a world that is no stranger to conflict. But there's something about the word nuclear that still has the power to stop us in our tracks. It starts quietly, not with an explosion, not with the sound of alarms, but with silence. A silence that builds over years. A silence that hides behind technical terms, buried deep in official reports. And yet, it's the kind of silence that speaks the loudest, if you know how to listen. For years, we've heard whispers of uranium being enriched in underground facilities, of machines spinning day and night, of lines being crossed. Not loudly, but slowly, like footsteps you don't hear until they're already behind you. Iran's nuclear journey didn't begin with a countdown to destruction. It began with ambition. And it began with the threat, the pressure to engender the world, and also to engender the threat to destroy. Our job is to wait. We need the nuclear promises to destroy, the pressure to destroy. You can track the process, but not where it came from. You can see the process, and that can be fast and furious. We should not live by the mustachio. Whether it's the pointed attack, the pointed sabotage, the pointed intensity, the pointed wait, we should not with energy, with the promise of scientific advancement. That's what the world was told. Peaceful, harmless, controlled. But as time passed, those intentions became harder to trust. Transparency faded, access for inspectors was limited. And the more the program grew, the harder it became to believe that it was only about light bulbs and hospitals. Today, Iran holds uranium enriched far beyond what is needed for energy. It's no longer a secret, it's an open reality. Experts say they have reached levels of 60% purity. To the average person, that might not sound alarming, but those who understand nuclear science know this. Once a nation can reach 60%, 90% is not far behind. And 90% is what it takes to build a bomb. It's like watching a match being held closer and closer to dry grass. The fire hasn't started yet, but you can smell the smoke. You can feel the tension in the air. And here's the hard truth. This isn't just about one country gaining power. It's about the fear of what they'll do with that power. It's about history, about threats made in speeches, in rallies, in television broadcasts, words that promised destruction to another nation. When you hear those words and then see those same leaders racing toward nuclear capability, you can't help but wonder, what happens if they mean it? That's why the world watches Iran so closely. Not because of hatred, but because of fear. A fear that isn't born out of imagination, but out of patterns, out of what's been said, out of what's already been done. There have been deals, agreements meant to slow the progress, to create trust, to build accountability. But those deals, like many things in politics, are fragile, easily broken. And every time they fall apart, the timeline moves faster. The options become fewer. There's something deeply unsettling about watching a nation stand on the edge of such power. It's not just about physics. It's about intention. Will they cross the final line, or will someone stop them before they do? Because once the knowledge exists, once the material is ready, it becomes a question of choice. And in moments like these, we realize how fragile peace really is. It's not made of treaties or policies. It's made of restraint, of wisdom, of leaders who choose dialogue over dominance. But restraint is hard when history is filled with hurt, when borders are soaked in old wounds, when trust has been broken more than it's been built. And yet, here we are, closer than ever, not to war perhaps, but to the point where decisions must be made, difficult ones, risky ones, because letting things continue as they are, that might be the riskiest decision of all. It's easy to feel powerless watching it all unfold, to scroll through the headlines, shake our heads, and move on. But somewhere, deep down, we know this isn't just their problem. It's ours too. Because when nuclear weapons enter the conversation, no one is far away enough. Borders blur. Maps mean nothing. Fallout has no passport. So we watch, and we wait, and we hope that wisdom will rise before ego does. Because this timeline, it's more than uranium levels and laboratory data. It's a mirror, showing us how close we are to repeating the very things we swore we'd never let happen again. And maybe that's the hardest part. Knowing how close we've come and how little time there may be left to change course. But maybe, just maybe, if enough voices rise, not in fear, but in courage, this silence can be broken, not by war, not by fire, but by truth, by humility, by the kind of leadership that doesn't just think about power, but about people, about life, about what's worth saving. Before it's too late, there's a moment in every story when the line gets drawn, not in the sand, but in the heart. A point you reach when silence is no longer strength and waiting becomes risk. For nations, that line is called a red line, unseen but deeply understood, not always written in treaties or declared in speeches, but known, clear, uncrossable. And for Israel, Iran's nuclear ambition is that line. It didn't happen overnight. It built up over years, like a storm in slow motion, one enrichment level at a time, one hidden facility after another. The world watched as Iran moved closer, closer to something it promised never to pursue. But promises in politics are fragile, and in the Middle East even more so. Sometimes red lines are not drawn to threaten, they are drawn to remind, to say, this is as far as we can go before everything changes. And while many countries have red lines, few are willing to act when those lines are crossed, because the cost is always too high, the consequences too uncertain. But some countries, some leaders, believe the greater cost is doing nothing. And that's when silence breaks, that's when missiles fly, and that's when headlines turn into heartbreak. The truth is, in diplomacy, there's a constant tug of war between trust and suspicion. You sign deals, you shake hands, you take pictures, but behind the smiles is an unspoken truth. Everyone's watching everyone. And when one side even hints at betrayal, the other side prepares for battle. Iran says its nuclear program is peaceful for energy, for medicine, for pride, and maybe for some time the world wanted to believe that. Maybe we hoped for a version of the story that didn't end in confrontation. But hope without evidence is dangerous. And every time Iran refused an inspection, every time they restarted enrichment beyond agreed levels, that hope began to fade, until all that was left was suspicion. And that's when the red line starts glowing, right? Demanding attention, begging for action. It's not just about uranium or centrifuges. It's about intent. And intent is always the hardest thing to prove. But sometimes it's not about what's said, it's about what's done. And when someone keeps walking toward the edge after being told to stop, you have two choices. Either keep warning or finally act. That's where we are now. And it's terrifying because one action leads to another. One strike leads to retaliation. And soon, it's not about red lines anymore. It's about survival, about pride, about showing the world that you won't be ignored. And yet, somewhere in the middle of this standoff are people. Innocent, ordinary people. Mothers putting their children to bed. Fathers trying to earn a living. Teenagers dreaming about love and life and laughter. None of them chose this. None of them benefit from it. And yet they're always the ones who pay the highest price. That's what makes these red lines so painful, because while leaders argue over policies and power, the rest of us live in the fear of what happens if those lines are crossed. We live with the ache of knowing how close we are to a war we never asked for. And yet, the world keeps drawing lines in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Taiwan, and now, again, between Iran and Israel. Maybe we need to ask, what's the point of a red line if the only response is destruction? What if strength isn't about attacking, but about listening? What if real courage is not about making the first strike, but the first compromise? We all want safety, we all want security, but how far are we willing to go to protect it? And at what cost? Because once the missiles fly, they don't just break buildings, they break families, they break futures. So yes, red lines matter, but maybe it's time we start asking a different question. Not just what will we do if they cross it, but what can we do before they even get close? Maybe there's still time, maybe not. But if there is, even just a sliver, we owe it to those who have no power, no voice, no say in this fight. We owe them more than lines and threats and fears. We owe them peace. And peace doesn't come from weapons. It comes from wisdom, from humility, from knowing that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not to draw another line, but to take a step back and say, this doesn't have to end in fire. Maybe that's the message the world needs to hear most right now, before it's too late. It started the way most storms do, not with thunder, but with a quiet shift in the wind. And then suddenly, everything changed. In the middle of the night, missiles lit up the sky, targets were struck, conversations turned into sirens, and a region already on edge was pushed even closer to a tipping point. People woke up not knowing what had happened, only that something had. There were no declarations, no formal warnings, just fire in the distance and fear in the air. And that's how the world found out. Israel had struck again. But this wasn't just about destroying buildings or disabling systems. This was about sending a message, one louder than any speech, one clearer than any diplomatic letter, a message that said, we see what you're doing, and we will not wait. Because when a country feels like its back is against the wall, when it believes time is running out, action becomes a form of survival. And sometimes the scariest kind of war isn't the one fought in daylight, it's the one happening in the shadows in silence until suddenly it's not. These recent strikes weren't random. They were precise, calculated, aimed at facilities linked to nuclear development, intelligence infrastructure, and weapons production. But underneath those targets are stories, people, lives that exist between the lines of geopolitics and strategy. For Israel, these strikes were a response, not to a single event, but to years of buildup, years of warnings, years of watching their most vocal enemy inch closer to nuclear capability. And while some call it aggression, others call it defense. Not an act of war, but a desperate attempt to delay one. Because when you believe a threat is not just political, but existential, you don't wait for permission to act. You don't wait for the world to agree with you. You move. Because history has taught you what waiting can cost. Still, the aftermath is never just tactical. It's emotional. It's spiritual. It's a mother crying as dust covers the photo of her son. It's a father searching through rubble, not for answers, but for anything that proves his child was once here, that they had a name, a life. And that's the part we rarely talk about, the part that doesn't make it into news briefings or official statements. The human cost. Every missile carries more than explosives. It carries questions, doubts, regret, even for those who believe it was necessary. Because no one walks away from this unchanged. Not the ones who ordered the strikes, not the ones who survived them. And yet, here we are again, in a cycle that feels all too familiar. Strike, doom, retaliation, condemnation, silence, repeat. It makes you wonder, how many times can the same story unfold before someone decides to rewrite it? The truth is, these recent actions didn't come out of nowhere. They came from frustration, from fear, from a feeling of isolation, a sense that diplomacy has failed, that words have lost their meaning, that promises have turned into poison. And when a nation feels like the world is watching but not listening, this is what happens. They stop talking, they start acting, but no matter how strategic a strike may be, it cannot guarantee peace. It can delay, it can disrupt, But peace, that's something else entirely. It takes more than force. It takes faith. Faith that your enemy can change. Faith that dialogue is still worth pursuing, even after all the pain. And that's not easy. Especially when you've spent decades learning how to protect yourself, how to stand alone, how to fight before you're hit. Still, what if there's another way? What if these recent strikes, instead of being just another act of war, became a turning point? What if, this time, the silence that follows is not just the absence of bombs, but the beginning of a different kind of conversation? One that says, we don't want this to be normal. We don't want fear to be our future, because deep down every nation wants the same thing: safety, security, the chance to build a life without looking over your shoulder. And maybe, just maybe, the people on both sides want that more than they want revenge. We've seen what missiles can do. We've seen the damage, the division, the darkness they leave behind. Maybe now is the time to ask what mercy can do, what understanding can create, what restraint might save. Because war may start with fire, but peace starts with a whisper, a decision, a pause, and a hope that somehow, somewhere, someone will be brave enough to say no more. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. And when that day comes, maybe we'll finally see a sky that isn't lit by missiles, but by morning. A morning without fear. And that is worth fighting for. You can feel it, even if you don't live there. Even if you've never walked the streets of Jerusalem or prayed under the desert sky in Tehran. There's a heat rising in the Middle East. Not just from the sun, but from something far more dangerous. From words, from weapons, from wounds that never really healed. You hear it in the way leaders speak now. Louder, sharper, less patient. You see it in the eyes of ordinary people who have grown tired of holding their breath. The tension isn't new, but it feels different now. It feels like something is simmering just below the surface, waiting for one spark to set it all off. This isn't just about two countries, it never is. When one nation makes a move, the rest feel the tremor. Borders don't hold back fear. Missiles don't always land where they're supposed to. And when one side hits, the other feels entitled, almost obligated, to hit back harder. That's the rhythm of this region, a rhythm built on retaliation. Iran and Israel have danced this dance before. Proxy wars, cyber attacks, mysterious explosions no one claims, but everyone understands. And now those shadows are stepping into the light. Words are turning into strikes. Diplomacy is fading into noise. And the people caught in the middle? They're left wondering how much more they can take. It's not just about nuclear programs or airstrikes. It's about dignity, about pride, about histories carried in bloodlines and battlefields. Every move made in that region isn't just political, it's personal. Generations have grown up hearing stories of betrayal, of occupation, of survival. And when you grow up in pain, you begin to believe that peace is a lie someone tells you to keep you quiet. That's why tensions don't cool easily here, because trust was broken before most of us were even born. And rebuilding trust takes time they believe they don't have. So what happens next? What happens when patience runs out? When diplomacy sounds like weakness and strength looks like launching the first strike? The danger isn't just in the weapons, it's in the desperation to be seen, to be heard, to be taken seriously. And the sad thing is, no one's really listening. Not the way they should. The world moves on to the next headline, the next crisis, the next distraction. But this region, it doesn't forget. It stores every silence. It remembers who spoke up and who stayed quiet. And now, with each passing day, it feels like another line is being crossed, another red flag raised, more troops moved, more threats exchanged, and hope which once felt distant now feels almost impossible But even in all that, even in the boiling point of rage and retaliation, there is still something left. A whisper, a longing, not for war, but for peace. Because deep down, the mothers on both sides of the border want the same thing: to raise their children without fear, to sleep without listening for sirens, to stop looking at the sky and wondering if it's the last time they'll see it. There are people, millions of them, who don't want revenge, who don't want missiles, who don't want politics. They just want life, ordinary, simple life. And that's the tragedy, that the loudest voices are not always the wisest, that power often drowns out peace, that history keeps repeating because no one is brave enough to break the pattern. But maybe that can change. Maybe it has to, because this time the stakes feel different. This time the world isn't just watching, it's trembling. Because if the Middle East erupts, really erupts, it won't stay contained. It never does. Oil prices rise, refugees flee, markets crash, and fear spreads like wildfire. So maybe now is the time for those with influence, with compassion, with conscience, to stand up and say, enough, not to take sides, but to save lives, not to win arguments, but to win back the chance for peace. Because the world doesn't need more weapons, it needs more wisdom. It doesn't need more proof of who is stronger, it needs proof that humanity still matters. The Middle East is boiling, but boiling doesn't have to end in breaking. It can be the moment before transformation, before healing, before change. It just takes someone, anyone, to choose peace, to risk being called weak in order to be strong for the voiceless, to speak softly when the world only knows how to shout. Maybe that's the miracle we're still waiting for. And maybe in all the tension, the tears, and the tiredness, that miracle is closer than we think. Sometimes the most important questions aren't the ones shouted in press conferences or debated in front of cameras. They're the quiet ones. The ones asked behind closed doors, with a shaky voice, a worried heart, and eyes that are just tired of watching everything fall apart. Why now? Why did it have to be now? Why did the tension have to snap at this moment, when so many people are just trying to survive, when families are already drowning in uncertainty, when the world itself feels like it's balancing on a thread? There are always reasons, always justifications, timelines, strategies, intelligence briefings, filled with maps, predictions, and warnings. But behind all those explanations is a deeper reality. Something pushed this moment into motion. Something whispered that time was running out. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was frustration. Maybe it was a mixture of both, building up over years of watching, waiting, warning, and still feeling ignored. The world has known about Iran's nuclear ambitions for decades. Talks have come and gone, deals were signed then broken, sanctions imposed then lifted. And while the headlines changed, one thing stayed the same: the unease. The worry that one day the warnings wouldn't be enough, that silence would cost more than action. And for Israel, that day seems to have arrived. It wasn't a random decision, it wasn't an impulse. It was a buildup, not just of uranium, but of anxiety, of pressure, of the haunting belief that if something isn't done now, the consequences could be irreversible, that hesitation today could mean devastation tomorrow. But timing is everything, and timing like this always comes with a cost. Because while leaders argue about national security and global strategy, it's the people who pay the price. The ones who wake up to windows shattered by shock waves, the ones who hold their children tighter, unsure if they should flee, hide, or simply pray that nothing else happens tonight. And so we ask again, why now? Is it because diplomacy failed again? Because the talks lost their meaning? Because the hand that once reached out was slapped too many times? Or is it because politics demands action? Because leaders are expected to appear strong, decisive, unshaken? Maybe it's both. Maybe this moment was born from more than one reason, layered with personal convictions and national pride. But even if the reasons are clear, the risk remains, because war never ends where it starts. It spreads. It echoes, and it drags everyone into its grip, whether they believe in the cause or not. The timing of this strike, this decision to act, will be remembered, not just for its strategic importance, but for what it means to the world. That a red line was crossed not just by Iran, but by the very idea that conflict was inevitable. When we ask why now, we're really asking something deeper. Was there no other way? Was every door truly closed? Was every chance for peace truly exhausted? Because if there was even one left unexplored, one conversation left unspoken, then we must wonder what could have been saved. Sometimes leaders act not because they want to, but because they feel they have no choice. And maybe that's what makes this moment so heartbreaking. That we've come to a place where countries feel safer launching missiles than trusting words, where preemptive strikes feel more reliable than peace talks. And maybe that's what the world should be worried about most. That the fear of what might happen has become more powerful than the hope of what could. So here we are, asking, hoping this won't turn into something worse. Because deep down, we all know. The question isn't just why now? It's also what now? What happens next? Will this be the beginning of more destruction, more division, more despair? Or can it be the wake-up call the world so desperately needs? To act not with vengeance, but with vision. We don't know yet. But one thing's clear. If this moment, this act leads to more bloodshed, more broken families, more broken promises, then why now will echo not just in the halls of power, but in the hearts of those who lost everything they loved. And if somehow this moment leads the world back to the table, to dialogue, to dignity, then maybe, just maybe, why now won't just be a question about pain. It might become a turning point, a reason to rebuild, a reason to believe again in something better. And that's the answer worth praying for. We may not have power over bombs, but we have power over belief. And belief, that's where all real change begins. So before we close this chapter, let's not just ask, how close is Iran to a bomb? Let's also ask, how close are we to losing our humanity trying to stop one? Thank you for listening. And if this made you think, even for a second, then maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of peace.